Welcome to the Black Daily Digest, your destination for Black news, social commentary, and information. And to help you navigate through it all, BDD is hosted by Adrian Massey, Brianne Wright, Maisha Gilmore, Tandria Dixon, and Esther Anderson. Don't forget to like, follow, share, and subscribe on all of our social media platforms at MyBDD News.
So I just wanted to continue the conversation about school reopening from our last episode. So we had a segment on the teacher strike in Chicago that resulted from Mayor Lightfoot in the Chicago public school system planning for pre-K and special education programs to resume in person on Thursday, February 11th, followed by students in kindergarten through 5th grade returning March 1st and students from 6th to 8th grade returning March 8th. And that was actually delayed. The school system wanted them to start reopening earlier, but because of this strike, they had a cool down period and pushed back the dates for reopening to these dates that I just mentioned. So at the time, the CDC had not yet released its operational strategy for the reopening of K-12 schools. So I suggested, my opinion on the last episode was that no one should be forcing anybody to do anything until there are clear guidelines on exactly how reopening should happen and how to get schools prepared to do that. So the updated guidelines were released on February 12th. So I'm just going to run through some of the key points from that. So firstly, mitigation strategies are stratified by the level of community transmission. So there are two indicators. One is the total number of new cases per 100,000 persons in the last 7 days. And the second is the percent of positive tests during the last 7 days. And so they're recommending these weekly indicators to be collected. And so the levels range of community transmission range from low transmission to high transmission, and in between are moderate and substantial transmission. And just some main things that stood out to me from the updated guidelines were, regardless of the level of community transmission, all schools should be using and layering the mitigation strategies. And so the two that always stand out that should always be followed are the universal and correct use of masks at all levels of transmission, and then physical distancing of at least 6 feet and maximizing it to the greatest extent possible. So other mitigation strategies are hand washing, cleaning and maintaining facilities, and contact tracing. Obviously in combination with like isolating, quarantining when folks are exposed. Some other interesting points that stood out to me is at any level of community transmission, all schools should have the option to provide in-person instruction. So they're saying, even if a school is in the high transmission red category, they should still have an option for in-person instruction, either full or hybrid. So it doesn't have to be full in-person instruction, but they should have an option for in-person instruction. And that is with strict adherence to the mitigation strategies that I described above. Another thing that I thought was helpful was, the lower incidence of COVID-19 among younger children compared to older children. So with that statistic, it means that younger children are at substantially less risk of in-school transmission in in-person learning than older kids, and so that suggests that it should be safe or safer to open elementary schools, although middle and high school students, depending on the community level of transmission, could have hybrid learning. Also, what interesting to me, at least, was that even with this strong encouragement for schools to reopen in person, they also suggested that for any family or student who's at increased risk of severe illness due to COVID, there should always be an option given for virtual instruction, regardless of the mode that's currently offered for the entire school. And just personally, in my situation and with my niece, we just had to switch her to a whole new school because her school was requiring all students to go back to brick and mortar, which our family is at increased risk for severe illness, and I my sister wrote a letter to the school and everything, but there were no options for virtual learning, even for families and students at risk, which I thought was unacceptable. So I'm glad to see this in writing in these guidelines, and had this come out before, we probably could have kept her in the same school and used this argument. Um, and a couple of other things, they, according to the guidelines, because of these new variants of SARS-CoV-2, although this just came out, this pretty substantial comprehensive guidance, this is likely going to need to be updated because the new variants are more transmissible and cause more severe illness and could require more and different mitigation strategies. So this is a good step in the right direction, but these, strategies will have to continuously be updated as the situation for COVID changes. And just some additional prevention measures in schools that were suggested were diagnostic testing for any student, teacher, or staff member who exhibits symptoms, also screening, which is intended to identify infected individuals that don't have any symptoms. And then the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices also recommends that teachers be included in the frontline essential workers, specifically in Phase B for vaccination. Teachers are not required to be vaccinated, but they should be prioritized as another effective mitigation measure. So considering this updated information, I do feel slightly more comfortable with younger kids returning, but obviously a lot rests on the funding that communities might need to implement all of these strategies, especially like physical distancing. It depends on the number of students in the school, the square footage, et cetera. So these communities, and especially for equitable reopening of schools. So urban communities, low-income communities, we need to make sure that everybody can return to school safely and that they have the funding in place to do so. So my question on this is just whether anybody else's opinion has changed since reading the new guidelines. If there's any opinions you want to share, happy to hear.
I just agree that it would be nice if the teachers could be considered in the frontline defense and could get vaccinated. Even I even push to say students as well, because they require regular vaccinations for kids to go to school. Why not COVID vaccinations as well before kids are forced to go back to in-person schooling? That's just my stance. That's my take on it, and I really have not much else to say about it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think the issue with kids was that they were not in the trials, like the safety trials. I think under
Okay.
16. Don't quote me on that. I'll have to look that up. But I think it was only 16 years old and above who were included in the trial. So we just don't know how safe it is yet for kids. But I guess that wasn't as much as a priority because they are less likely to spread and get severely ill from COVID. But I agree that the more time we have and the more trials, like I think right now they're just doing these active trials on pregnant women and how it affects, mothers, fetuses, newborns, etc. So they started off with, I think, 16 and older in the trials, and I think now they're starting to target some specific subgroups to get more information. I just don't know how available it is yet.
I know I don't have kids, so for me, it's not a it's not a issue that I have personally. But I do have nieces and nephews. But I still think with the improved guidelines, I still don't think that my nieces and nephews probably would go to in-person learning. At the current moment, two at the current moment, one of them has suffered just a little bit from virtual school, but they're slowly picking it back up. So I think if they can improve and continue to improve and stay on the right track academically, that their mom more than likely would not send them back to public school, or she would be the type to try to enroll them into private school, because I know there's been an uptick in private school enrollment just because they have certain mitigation factors, like because the classrooms are already smaller, that they have enough funding, private funding, to help to increase social distancing measures within the school itself. So, and they can effectively do it quicker than to wait on like federal changes to happen. So if my nieces and nephews do go back to school, I'm pretty sure she's going to enroll them into a private school where these certain measures and certain rules can be implemented faster, and they can go above and beyond than the guidelines that have been set for them. But all in all, I like that we're taking it more serious. They're starting to do more research into how this affects kids going back to school and their transmission rates on how if they can get it, if they could possibly transmit it to their families. That's I think that's the scariest part of it all. Is like even if the kids get it, how when they if they do spread it back to their family, how fast will it spread? How big of an impact will it have? So I don't know, but I just know it's a scary time for parents out there who have kids that are still contemplating if they should send their kids back to school or not.
Yeah, I would have to agree with Esther. I don't have too much to say, but I do agree that if they have to be vaccinated for everything else, well, I do agree that they maybe should be added to being vaccinated if they need to be in school. Because my children are in school right now against my wishes, but they just have to go for the sake of making sure they maintain their grades. And I feel like the school is doing a lot to maintain the precautions and follow the CDC guidelines, but it's still, you just really never know. And I mean, my kids are getting COVID tests every couple weeks and it's stopping, but I don't know. I'd rather them not be at school, but I'm happy they have those guidelines out there. So I do agree with Esther though. I think you should at least make a vaccine mandatory if they're gonna be in school. Cause then that's at least giving us, I hope, a fighting chance for us to keep the transmission down, especially with all these different variants coming out. Like, I'm a little bit, not to go off subject, I mean, still COVID related, but my family lives in England, and I was talking to my aunt on Thursday, and they're on lockdown. They have been on lockdown since I think like the end of January or the middle of January. And they can't go nowhere, and they get fined if they break a social distance law. Like, if you're grouped together and it's more than like 8 or 10 of y'all, they're giving you you have to pay 200 pounds. And every time you break it, it goes up and up and up. Personally, I got really excited when she said that, and I was like, I know it won't come to America, but I just feel like we're not taking it as Americans. We don't take COVID seriously at all, because looking at how many people just go out and eat and do everything, not that we can't go and get our necessities, but it's just everybody's still living life like COVID ain't nothing. And then, oh crap, now I have COVID, and so now you're deathly ill. Duh, because it's still out here. So I just feel like generally it's great they have these guidelines for the school, but the school ain't where the problem is, because my kids don't even want to be near other people. They're social distance junkies. Little kids, once you teach them something, they pretty much gonna utilize it. So I think the stats with the little kids not really being gonna contract it or spreading it like that, them having lower rates, that makes sense to me. I think it's the big people and the adults who have the problem, and that's really what my concern is. It's not really sending my kids to school and being around other kids. That was my concern, but seeing the numbers in my children's school, because they give us the numbers every week, they don't really have that many cases of students having COVID. It's more teachers with COVID, and it's more teachers that have to be quarantined. So my problem is the adults, not the children.
You're absolutely right. A lot of that is what these guidelines are saying, that it's the community transmission levels that's going to determine what the schools have to do in terms of mitigation strategies. So that's really important to know. And I will just say, I checked, and currently Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna have ongoing trials. They're currently underway with children 12 and older. So still just, older than both some of your kids, but they have 12 to 15 in Pfizer BioNTech, and I think it's 12 to 18. I think Pfizer BioNTech was the only one that originally included children as young as 16 or youth as young as 16. So hopefully there should be more and more trials that are starting with younger and younger kids, and it'll probably be a situation, especially with these new variants coming out, that there'll have to be booster shots and things like that we have with other viruses. So it may be something that does become part of our reality moving forward.
Thank you for tuning into the Black Daily Digest. Don't forget to like, follow, share, and subscribe on all of our social media platforms at MyBDD News.